In this section, we're going to kick off talking about the fourth category of acquisition loops, sales loop. A sales loop is pretty simple. It's where a company distributes the value prop via humans using a sales force in a way that attracts more customers. And as we attract more customers, we can reinvest that capital into more humans. So very simply, the steps of a sales acquisition loop is that we get a new customer, we use that capital to fund adding more reps to the sales force, and then those reps go out there, work the leads, and acquire more customers, repeating the steps of the loop. The sales loops are always paired with another loop flow that generates leads. So when we look at a sales loop and are trying to identify some of the key levers to move, a lot of times we need to be looking at what type of lead loop the sales loop is paired with. Let's take a look at a couple different examples. The concept of an inbound sales loop. HubSpot uses a company-generated content loop to generate leads. They're acquiring more leads, generating content. That content is distributed to attract more visitors, which acquires more leads. And as those leads are acquired, they're transitioned over to a sales loop to turn those leads into customers. And so there's this balance point between the leads and the reps working those leads that generates and affects the efficiency of both of these loops. We can take a look at another example because a company-generated content loop is not the only other type of lead loop. There's also product loops. If we thought about Slack, for example, they have a viral loop generating more users and leads, but they pair that with a sales loop for a specific segment of their customers, typically enterprises in large companies. So that viral loop is generating those leads, and then those reps work those leads to generate new customers where the viral loop isn't enough to get them over the line. As the other loops, sales loops are not mutually exclusive. So if we thought about HubSpot as an example, they use a combination of both an inbound loop, which has paired with a company-generated content lead loop, an outbound loop, which is paired with more of an outbound lead loop, as well as what's called a VAR loop, where they're using partners to generate some of the sales. There's three primary constraints on any type of sales loop. The first is the productivity of the rep. A sales rep is always going to be constrained on the amount of time in the month. So the time it takes to basically convert a lead into a customer is going to affect how many customers they can produce within that month. So we want to understand how productive a rep can be. The thing about this is that we can influence this productivity within a time frame based on the type of lead loop that we are using. Of course, the increase that we see in the number of leads, quality of the leads, or the intent of leads is going to directly affect the amount of rep productivity. There's other levers that we can use to increase rep productivity, but the amount and quality of the leads is certainly the primary one. The second thing that we can think about is time to productivity. So how much time in this step of the sales loop where we're adding reps does it take to get somebody fully productive, right? So it takes months for somebody to learn how to sell a product in the most efficient way. The faster we're able to do that, the faster we're able to spin the sales loop. The third main constraint on a sales loop is the capital. So very similar to a paid loop, the sales loop relies on reinvesting the capital generated from customers into adding more reps. And the more reps that we're able to add, the faster the sales loop spins, the more customers are produced from a cycle of the loop. So very similar to the paid loop, we need to pay attention to this capital, things like payback period, and how we're able to reinvest that capital. So looking at a sales loop, once again, all sales loops are paired with different types of lead loops. That's kind of what determines what type of sales loop it is. There's three primary constraints to a sales loop: rep productivity, time to productivity, as well as capital. And to measure sales loops, we're going to want to align those metrics to those constraints. In the next section or lesson, we're going to be looking at the keys to sales loops and going through some of the different types of sales loops.